He used to be called Citizen 625726. He used to call himself Unbroken. When he left his dystopian city behind, he thought he had found paradise. What he found was uglier and darker than anything he could have imagined. This is his story. This is Inferior. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at studiobrainstorm.net. Links in the description. Being a civilization constantly at war, the Imperium of Man has innumerable fighting formations. All of them constantly fighting, striving, and dying in the service of the Imperium and humanity's ultimate survival. It is perhaps the greatest irony of the Warhammer 40k universe, therefore, that often, in order to defend humanity, those self-same defenders are required to sacrifice their own humanity. Sometimes the sacrifice is metaphorical. Each individual Imperial Guardsman is taught to think of himself as little more than a cog in the Imperial war machine, and that the greatest service he can perform for his god is to sacrifice his life on the altar of victory. The Sisters of Battle are required by their church upbringing to sacrifice all finer sensibilities to the fires of faith and fanaticism. An Imperial assassin is ruthlessly conditioned to be nothing more than a highly efficient tool of murder. In some cases, the sacrifice of humanity is more literal. The tech priests of the Mechanicus literally shed portions of their flesh in pursuit of what they believe is a superior state of being. And of course, the Space Marines, the most famous of Imperial warriors, are taken as children and then genetically and psychologically modified to be the ultimate super soldiers, knowing nothing else but war. So much more, and yet so much less than what they once were and could have been. But while the Adeptus Astartes are the most well-known transhuman defenders of the Imperium, they are not the greatest. That distinction belongs to the Brotherhood of Demigods, the Watchers of the Throne, the Guardians, the Golden Legion, the 10,000, the Adeptus Custodes. The Custodians are as old as the Imperium itself, literally. Of all Imperial institutions, they predate all others. They were there before the Arbites, before the Navigator Houses, before the Space Marines, even before their predecessors, the Thunder Warriors. From the earliest days of the Terran Unification Wars, accounts speak of the Emperor and his silent guardians, each one clad in master-crafted suits of golden auramite power armor, armed with bolt-casting guardian spears, ever vigilant and utterly peerless in battle. If the Adeptus Astartes are super soldiers, the Custodians were super soldiers times 10. In short, they were super Space Marines before Games Workshop decided that it was cool and came up with the Primaris Marines. If someone ever asks me what is the difference between an Astartes and a Custodes, I like to use the example of two different chairs. One is mass-produced, sturdy, functional, does its job admirably. The second, while just as functional, is also a work of art, the kind that can only be created by the world's finest custom furniture makers. Where an Astartes neophyte starts out as a pre-adolescent and undergoes various surgeries in which the various gene seed organs are implanted, a Custodes aspirant begins as an infant, and the technologies used in their ascension is, while not described, is said to be more subtle and ingenious, manipulating the infant on a cellular level. Back in the Unification Wars, the infants used for Custodes' ascension came from Terran nobility, and this is still the case in modern 40k. In fact, the noble families of Terra often compete vigorously for the honor of having a child be given to the Emperor's 10,000. Such acceptance is considered a great mark of prestige and honor, not too dissimilar from how certain cultures view sending their sons to their local Astartes chapter. Because the process of their ascension is more refined than that of the Astartes, although the Custodes essentially, we assume, have the same superhuman abilities as a Space Marine, they are many times better. The general view is that one Custodes could take on 3 Space Marines and win with relative ease. But the Custodians aren't just different from their Space Marine cousins physically, they are also mentally different. Space Marines were created for the singular purpose of war. As such, there is a bellicosity and aggressiveness to their personalities, though of course there is some variation based on the individual and the culture of the chapter they belong to. But the Custodians were made to be the Emperor's companions, in peace as well as in war. As such, barring again individual variations in personality type, Custodians tend to lack that aggressiveness of the Space Marine. They are more intellectual and detached, more mild of temperament. The Custodians are fully aware of this, and as a result, though they are usually impeccably polite towards Space Marines when they interact with them, there's always an undercurrent of condescension, usually ranging from mild disdain to pity for their fellow transhumans. Others, particularly the senior officers, regard the Astartes with suspicion and mistrust. It was, after all, the Astartes legions that turned traitor that brought about the end of the Great Crusade and the second golden age of humanity. There is one possible exception to this, the Grey Knights chapter. Created in the final days of the Horus Heresy as the Emperor's last gambit against the powers of chaos. One of the defining personality traits of a Custodian is their sheer confidence in their place in the universe. They were the Emperor's best, his chosen companions, those that would stand at his side through peace and war as he reshaped humanity into a new galactic empire. No other beings in the Imperium can claim to be closer to the master of mankind than themselves. But the Grey Knights were also directly created by the Emperor's own hand. He shaped them just as thoroughly as he did the Custodes. And given what happened during the heresy and afterward, and the reason for which the Grey Knights were created, it hints at the one tiny chink in the otherwise gold-plated armor of the Custodians' sense of self and their place in the Imperium. Quoting Shield Captain Valerius, "We always knew of their existence. There are records held privately in the depths of our archives which chronicle their creation. We watched 10,000 years ago as he embarked upon his last gambit. As the great enemy drew closer to Terra, we observed the darkening of Saturn's moon and knew that one day it would return, its purpose fulfilled. Consider what this history means. We know that they came after us, the more junior creation, and yet they were as closely associated with him as we were. We both of us look to him and him alone as our progenitor, and share the same sense, cultivated over the wearing aeons, that we enact his designs when all others falter. There are some among my brothers who do not see the sons of Titan as much more than specialized space marines, to be regarded with suspicion as part of that schismatic breed that caused us so much anguish in the past. A space marine may always fail, they believe, given enough time and enough reason, and thus they are all part of the same potentially aberrant strain. Some think that. Others, and I myself have often speculated in such a vein, cultivate a different misgiving. We know well enough that they were designed as his last great weapon, fitted to an age that he foresaw near the end of his earthly embodiment. What if it were they, not us, who most faithfully embodied his final legacy? You will never hear one of us say as much out loud, but that does not mean the suspicion does not exist. It skulks around the corridors of the hegemon like a foul odor, faint but hard to eradicate. This is especially interesting when you consider the fact that despite that they are derived from the genetic material of the Emperor himself, the most powerful human psyker to ever live, not a single Custodian has psychic potential, whereas the Grey Knights, another direct product of the Emperor's genetics, are an entire chapter of psykers. You would think that this would put the Custodies at a disadvantage against psychic foes or demons. But luckily, they've had very close ties with the Sisters of Silence since the late Great Crusade, mostly because they seem to be the only beings in the Imperium that are not bothered by their pariah gene. For all their incredible fighting prowess, the Custodians played a relatively minor role during the Great Crusade. Their duty, then as now, was the protection of the Emperor's person. They guarded him in life and, after his near death at the hands of Horus, the traitor War Master, they guard his corpse upon the Golden Throne and the Sanctorum Imperialis where it now lies. And these superhumans take this job very, very seriously. It's pretty much common knowledge that a custodian can and will stand on guard without food or water or even relieving himself for decades on end and still be at the top of his game in terms of strength and reflexes. When not guarding the halls of the palace or training their combat abilities, the Custodies engage in intellectual and artistic pursuits, again reflecting the fact that unlike the Astartes, they were created for more than just fighting. They are essentially as close to the ideal man in both physical and mental prowess as it is possible to be. Back when he was still fully functional, the Emperor would go to his Custodies not just for protection, but for advice. The Custodians were more than just protectors, they were also counselors and advisors, especially their first and most legendary Captain General, Constantine Valdor. If Malcador the Sigillite was the Emperor's right hand, Valdor was unquestionably the left. One of the weirder traditions of the Adeptus Custodes is the concept of the deed name. When a brother becomes a full custodian, he picks a single name, usually based on some ancient piece of Terran history or legend. From that point forward, for every great deed he accomplishes, every battle he wins, he adds another name to his already existing one, and he will inscribe it on the inside of his armor. Given that the Custodies are nigh immortal and the greatest fighters of humanity, this often means that the most senior custodians will have names that it would take an average human lifetime to recite in full. But of course, especially since the Horus Heresy book series began, one of the things the Custodies are most famous for is the Blood Games. Given that their primary role was to protect the Emperor, both before and after his internment, the Custodies want to make damn sure that it is impossible for any would-be assassin or enemy to get within spitting distance of the Master of Mankind. But how to ensure that, especially over the course of 10,000 years? This is the purpose of the Blood Games, to constantly test the defenses of the Imperial Palace. Usually a blood game involves select members of the Custodian Guard themselves trying to infiltrate the palace, the better to expose potential weak points and allow the Custodies to constantly keep their security up to date. Sometimes though, particularly after the heresy, the Custodies would actually send agents out into the universe and then bring back dangerous Xenos or even Chaos Space Marines and let them loose in the palace for the sake of variety and to practice against the real thing, given how rarely they leave the palace itself. Of course, like any fighting force in the Imperium, the Custodies have their own special groups and organization. Unlike other Imperial armies, the formations of the Custodies have Greek names, mostly because I think the people at Games Workshop were just sick of all the Latin, so they chose Greek purely for the sake of flavor. The Hekanatoi comprise the bulk of the Custodies, and are essentially those directly responsible for the protection of the palace. This formation is divided into two. First is the Sentinel Guard, which protects the palace in general, but also can act as defenders for specific emissaries or strong points within the palace. Second is the smaller and ultra-elite Hatiron Guard, those custodians favored with the supreme honor of standing within the Sanctorum Imperialis and personally protecting the Emperor and his golden throne. From there on, each formation of the Custodians becomes increasingly specialized. The Venetari, equipped with jump packs, essentially function as assault troops for the Custodies. The Thoranatoi are the elite shock troops clad in Terminator armor. The Cataphractoi are the jet bikers, as well as the pilots of Custodian gunships and fighters. The Epheroi specialize in espionage, counterintelligence, and assassination, while the Moratoi are the thankfully few brothers severely wounded enough to justify entombment within dreadnoughts. Finally, there is the Eyes of the Emperor, which is comprised of all things retired Custodians. 40K is a universe that, like it says on the tin, is grim and dark and is only filled with war. Retirement isn't exactly something that you would expect in such a future. However, the Custodians have very high standards, and though they are nigh immortal, they can age, however incrementally. Nothing less than the absolute best is acceptable when defending the Emperor is your top priority. And so, if a Custodian finds that his fighting abilities have decreased if only by the slightest of fractions, he may choose to retire. At least retire from combat duty, that is. He then turns in his armor, his bolt caster, and any other weapons he has, dons a massive black cloak, and becomes one of the eyes of the Emperor. A custodian formation whose singular purpose is to go out from Terra and identify any potential threats in the wider universe to the Imperium and to the Emperor. Given how immensely tall and massive they are, you would think that stealth isn't exactly something that a custodian would be all that skilled at. But on the other hand, recall that these are guys whose idea of a combat exercise is infiltrating the Imperial Palace, the most heavily guarded place in all of the galaxy. Plus, there is the fact that abhumans are pretty commonplace in the Imperium, so if worse comes to worse, a Custodes could find a way to pass himself off as, say, an Ogren. Admittedly, they also have some pretty fancy technological toys that allow them to project holograms that disguise their appearance from the casual viewer. This technology has even enabled some Custodes to pass for ordinary humans in the Imperium. As for rank and hierarchy, ordinary custodians are arranged into groups of 5 under the command of a shield captain. Anywhere between 10 or 20 of such squads form a shield host under the command of a captain commander. The shield host is essentially the custodian equivalent of a Space Marine chapter. Each has its own color scheme and specialized role within the Custodies. These range from the Aquilon Shield, whose purpose is to protect certain individuals believed to be valuable to the safety of Terra, to the Shadow Keepers, whose job it is to guard certain dark secrets from within the Imperial Palace, and the Solar Watch, who are charged with the defense of the Sol system in general. Above the shield hosts are 2 or 3 senior officers known as Tribunes. Finally, at the top of the heap is the Captain General, who is often supported and advised by a council of 10 senior custodians known as the Custodian Tribunate. Rather unsurprisingly, given their exalted role and close connection to the Emperor, the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes has always been counted among the High Lords of Terra. However, following the Horus Heresy, the Custodians chose to not involve themselves in the affairs of the Imperium, and dedicate themselves solely to the protection of the Emperor. In addition to this, there is also the Edict of Restraint, co-created by Rabute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, and Captain General Constantine Valdor in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy. The Edict of Restraint explicitly forbade the Custodies from ever departing Terra in force. Individuals or squads could participate in certain campaigns under specific circumstances, but the edict expressly forbade the Custodians from ever sending larger formations out into the galaxy to fight the Imperium's never-ending wars. That particular stance came to an end at the conclusion of the 41st millennia, with the formation of the Great Rift, the brief failure of the Astronomicon known as the Noctis Aeterna, and finally, with the demonic incursion upon the Imperial Palace known as the Battle of the Lion's Gate. The fact that demons had gotten this close to the Imperial Palace and to the Emperor was a little too close for comfort for the Custodes, and served as something of a wake-up call. They now realized that to ensure the Emperor's safety, it was not enough to simply defend the palace. And so, after several secret negotiations between the Primarch Rabute Guilliman and the Captain General of the Custodians, Trajan Valoris, the Edict of Restraint was abolished. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Custodes could go out in force and fight for humanity. Most in the Imperium view the restoration of Guilliman as a beacon of hope, a sign of a restoration, a new golden age for the Imperium. But the Custodians are more skeptical. They have very long memories, and they know all too well the kind of damage even a single Primarch is capable of. And while most of the Custodes concede that Guilliman does seem genuinely concerned with the well-being of the Imperium, they are loyal to the Emperor first and foremost. What if the day should come that Guilliman, ever practical, ever logical, should come to the conclusion that the interests of the Imperium and the interests of the Emperor are in conflict? Thus, when Guilliman declared the Indomitus Crusade, determined to take the fight to the enemies of humanity, Captain General Trajan Valoris decided that a contingent of Custodes should accompany the Primarch on his crusade, ostensibly as an honor guard and for the Avenging Sun's protection, but both sides know full well that the task of the Custodians is to act as Guilliman's watchdogs. A fact made fairly obvious by the fact that the leader of this Custodian contingent is Stratarchus Tribune Maldavar Culquan, an individual who has made no secret of his overt mistrust and hostility towards the Avenging Sun. Thus far, at least, most of the rank-and-file Custodies accompanying the Indomitus Crusade seem willing to give Guilliman the benefit of the doubt, and view Culquan as being overly paranoid at best and a horse's ass at worst. But they do also recognize the logic of Valoris' choice. If the worst should come to pass and Guilliman attempt a Horus 2.0, better to have on hand someone who will act without even a microsecond's hesitation. Still, it's not all worry and suspicion for the 10,000. The Custodians knew the Emperor more than anyone else. They understood his plans and his purpose as no one else did. They never believed in his divinity or in the semi-divinity of his sons. Still, the restoration of Guilliman is something that's hard to describe as anything other than miraculous. And if a son of the Emperor can be restored to mankind, perhaps, some of the more idealistic Custodians believe, it's not impossible that perhaps someday the Emperor himself may be restored. For 10,000 years, they have lived with the shame of failing to protect their master in his final confrontation with Horus. In fact, in some of the older versions of the lore, the Custodies were so ashamed of their failure that for 10,000 years they wore no armor at all, and were essentially just naked muscular giants in nothing but loincloths and helmets. A half-forgotten detail that would one day inspire one of the greatest 40k YouTubers of all time to make one of the best jokes of all time.